Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and I am not famous. I am, however, infamous, because I'm known as the guy who doesn't have based models. Like, I can paint a model really nicely. Like, some of the time. Sometimes I speed paint and they look awful, and that's fine. But my models can look pretty good, and my basing is never good. I actually have a secondary pile of shame, as it were, of models that I've painted, and just nothing is done on the base. And even when I do stuff to the base, it's usually just super gluing some baking powder and dry brushing it. Well, today I want to do something a little more interesting. It's not a lot more interesting, just a little more interesting, but it's certainly going to have a much nicer effect. Now I have behind me on my shelf, it's right there. All of that shelf there is my Soviet bolt-action army. I went a little bit crazy because it was my first bolt-action army, and I ended up with something like 130 infantry models. And so I really need a nice simple basing scheme that I can do on all of them. And so let's have a look at some examples of the models that I'll be putting stuff on. Here is a banner bearer from Bad Squiddo Games, and an assault engineer again from Bad Squiddo. This assault engineer with his nice little submachine gun, this is actually one of my 3D printed bodies to use up the spare plastic heads and arms and guns that comes with various model kits. So you can see he's got a rucksack on the back to hide some of the 3D print imperfections. You can still see some of it, but it's not really that big a deal, particularly as I'm bulking out the army with this type of stuff. And here I have a light mortar and another siege engineer that I haven't painted, but so long as the model is primed, I don't worry about whether the model is painted yet, because I can get the basing done and then kind of paint the model on top. It is a semi-separate operation. And what I want to do with the Soviets particularly is the classic Stalingrad, everything covered in snow kind of look. The winter themed, and a lot of mine are wearing greatcoats, not all of them, but enough of them to kind of give that feel. And so let's be sensible for 17/10ths of a second and have a look at some reference pictures. And that's exactly what I did. I looked up some snow, some dirty snow, some driven in snow, and some trampled and walked on snow. I did spend far too long on this, but that's beside the point. What I'm really seeing in these pictures is that it's not just a uniform white, and that's the important thing that I want to bring into my models, is all of that brown that's going on in the mud underneath that is still visible through. All of the kind of sloshy grey kind of ice and compacted snow, as well as the powdery white snow on top. Particularly when you get multiple days of snow, the first stuff gets trampled and mushy, and then you get this light dusting of snow on the top. And that is the kind of style that I want to create. And so, if I'm going to create muddy snow, the lowest layer of that is the mud. And I have a really simple method for mud, because if I'm going to do any basing, I'm going to do it simply. And so let's have a look at that. And the main ingredient, the primary ingredient, is flour. Into the flour I mix some PVA glue to hold it down, and I don't need to put PVA glue on the top, I just mix it in and it just makes it one step. Just for the off chance of having wet flour having around and to stop it from going mouldy, I do tend to put just a little bit of salt, just a little sprinkle, just to stop the anything growing while it dries, and to colour it, to make it look a little bit more like actual mud rather than, you know, compacted flour, is to mix in some craft paint. And this is super cheap stuff from, I think this was from Hobbycraft, but really cheap brown craft paint. Mix that in. Often I will add water as well to make it a more spreadable mix, but in this case the paint is actually very thin, very kind of watery, and so that's not necessary. And yeah, it's a simple case of just slathering that onto the bases. That's all there is. Now, having some batches added a little bit of sand extra into the mix, and that just gives it some variety. Having everything uniformly the same is incredibly dull when you're painting 130 models of an army, so having some variety, having a little bit of grit in some and more smooth wet mud on others, that is far more interesting. Although for some reason, and I'm not sure what caused this, I ended up with some really blotchy lumpy bits in my kind of mud mixture. But I just added those to certain bases to add the variety of heights, to have some bumps and some rolls rather than just completely flat ground. And that, again, variety is just a useful thing to make things look more interesting. And there's a whole bunch of models lined up with the mud drying off. This will take 12 or maybe 24 hours. I left it 24 hours to dry before doing some of the other bits, just to make sure that that's fully dry, because, you know, you're putting more paint on top, you're probably going to varnish it, like most people varnish their models these days. And speaking of fully drying out, disaster struck. Absolute disaster. I knocked over a glass of water all over my table, all over the models, while the mud mixture was still drying, and down the wall onto a power strip as well. Ugh. Thankfully I got lucky, I managed to dry everything out safely. However, when I came to dry out the models, I used this towel, and it was just ripping up the texture, kind of the mud texture that I created, and so I left them to air dry for another 24 hours. But I don't want to wait. I want to get on with this video and record some other bits. And so instead of using the models that I've just shown, putting the mud mixture on, I'm going to take these other models. And these are some more of my siege engineers. They all have the same 3D printed body with the plastic arms and heads. And let's get on to the next step with these that I have prepared earlier. And you'll also notice that the camera work changes. That's because my camera got wet as well, and I had to use my phone instead. And now we're going to introduce all of that grey that was in our reference pictures at the beginning. So we've got the kind of the brown still underneath, and we don't want to completely obliterate that, but we don't need all of the brown showing through. And so I'm just going to dry brush on grey, and I'm terrible at dry brushing. There is this kind of thing in the mini painting community that dry brushing is a beginner's technique and newbie technique. It's easy and not very good. Well, that's really strange because I can do quite a few techniques, but dry brushing is never one of the ones that turns out well for me. But let's get on with some dry brushing. I did my best. I tried to control my brush as best I could, and I just went over and dry brushed the base. But also, I actually put some light stipples of this grey over the model as well. And this is just to show that the characters have been running around, they've been moving, they've been standing around while it's been snowing, and their clothes have picked up just odd little bits of snow, and that kind of just adds to the effect. And the last step is, of course, as you probably have figured out by now, is a dry brush of white, and white stippling over the model as well, just to bring out those kind of picked up snow elements over the model. And this is where it really starts to come together. The bright white of the snow, particularly as I'm kind of doing the base rims. Not that there's an awful lot of base rim on a Warlord kind of disc base, but I'm still doing the rims in white just to complete that look. And it really does punch up the white, the kind of bright value of that in the lower part of the model. And because I'm using a dry brushing technique and just those little stipples on the model itself, the dustiness of the dry brushing really does look like a really simple, nice, quick scheme for doing snow that is surprisingly effective. Now, some of you may have noticed in the background, and particularly the Soviet players will maybe have picked up on the fact that there is a 6-strong siege engineers squad with a T-20 artillery tractor hanging out in the background, which has a transport capacity of 6. Gee whiz, I wonder if these two pieces of information are connected. But yes, I have a T-20 Komsomolets. I'm not entirely sure if that's the correct pronunciation. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not. But this is an artillery tractor that was used by the Soviet Union, but also has seats on top, and so you can ride around with some infantry as well. And this gets very much the same treatment. I have in the past already put splatters of mud. I didn't go really heavy with this, kind of just put the mud texture in certain places. Now, I've seen some people put texture paste over the entire tracks and halfway up the tank, which looks amazing, don't get me wrong, but I wanted to go a slightly cleaner route. But I dry brushed over it with grey, and I dry brushed not just on the mud, but actually around a lot of the tracks and the suspension system. around the top of the vehicle as well. And then again, dry brushing with white. A nice, simple, quick scheme. This only took a few minutes to do after the kind of texture paste was dry, of course. And I think they look amazing. I'm really happy with how this dusty snow technique looks with so little effort, and particularly as it's a basing technique that's quick and easy, and I don't really do basing very much, and so to do 120, 130 models, however many I've got these days, it's probably be 140 by the time this video is done. That's going to be great to clear those out and have them all with a pretty nice base. But hold on, some of you may have noticed in the background earlier in the video that I had a mortar and one crew on a 60mm base with lots of empty space. Well, that's because I like to do removable crew for kind of weapons teams, and that's so that when they take casualties you can actually remove the model to indicate that. You can glue them all down and use a die to just say 1, 2, 3 and then remove it when they're gone, but I like to do removable bases because it's kind of a fun thing, and I can use those models in other squads if I ever kind of need to bulk up a different unit for any reason. It's a thing. It's not required, but that's just the way I do things. Now, while the two individual separate crew get the texture paste and they're going to get dry brushed separately, for the main base, what I want to do is create a kind of an impression in the texture paste so that the bases of the extra crew can actually hang around and just sit there nice and neatly. And so I took two different models, and these happen to also be Soviets because, yeah, I'm going to get to the 140, it'll be 150 by the end of the video, don't worry about it, it's fine. And I'm going to wrap their bases, and kind of up to the ankles as well, just to have a nice place to tie it off, with cling film. And cling film, because of the glue that I'm using, PVA glue, the cling film will peel away at the end once it's all dry. Depending on what type of basing you're doing, you might need a different kind of barrier material, it's called, when you have a separating layer to pull some pieces away. But this is actually a really simple technique. I'm just going to lump on a whole bunch of the texture paste onto the 60mm base. And then when that's kind of all on there and nice and lumpy and thick and muddy and mucky, I'm just going to press the cling film covered model bases into it. And as that dries, that will conform to the cling film with the base inside and create a ringed impression for removable bases. Now, you do have to leave this for extra time. While a normal base will dry in about 24 hours, these, because there's no airflow whatsoever underneath the kind of the individual bases, the moisture has to travel through the material and escape out the side, and that takes a little bit longer. So in my case, I left this for 48 hours, 2 days. Depending on what texture paste, you might have to leave it a little bit longer, you might have to leave it a lot longer. Like I said, depends on what you're using. And here's the texture paste for the mortar team done, and as you can see, those two extra crew do fit in there quite nicely. They're not like super secure, they're not like a magnetized base, but on the tabletop they're not going to jump out and fly across the room or anything stupid like that. They sit there quite nice and neatly. But I do need to dry brush them, so I got stuck in with the grey dry brushing, and I gave this an all over heavy dry brush all over the place, all over the base. Now you'll notice that I haven't painted these models yet, and I will get to them. I do like painting the Soviets, but like I said earlier in the video, don't need to kind of paint the model first and then the base. I can do the base first and do the model later on, as long as I'm not priming it. Because priming will obviously kind of recolor the mud. And there we go, with the grey and then the white dry brushing, my mortar team is also ready for action. And even when you remove one of the bases, you can see the rim of where the base sits, but for the most part you just see the same muddy snow all over the place. And so that's all I have to say about that. It is a far too simple technique for this longer video, but there it is. I do tend to ramble, particularly when I can't be bothered to write a script, can you tell? Do let me know in the comment section what you think of my very simple technique and my style of talking. Do you like my not scriptedness, or do you prefer to have a bit more structure of pre-planning and thinking about what I actually want to say rather than just saying? But for now, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and I'll see you in the next video, and thank you all very much for watching.